The surroundings reeks of damp earth and adrenaline. Wood groans against stone as the lift begins its ascent. You are a superstar, yet you carry the mark of dishonor, a social outcast with fewer rights than a peasant. Welcome to Somnolent. We are stripping away the Hollywood fiction to expose the brutal economic and psychological machinery behind the Roman arena. This is the unvarnished life of the gladiator. To understand the gladiator, we must first understand the transaction. The arena was not just a theater of violence, it was a high-stakes market where human life functioned as the primary currency. The transition from a citizen or a captive into a gladiator was a process of legal and social annihilation. It was the moment a human being was recalculated as a commodity. This process began at the gates of the Ludus, the training school that served as both a college of arms and a high-security prison. The demographics of the barracks were a cross-section of Rome's expansion and its internal rot. The primary source of labor came from the borders. These were the damnati, the condemned. They were the human leftovers of Rome's military campaigns. Daci, Gauls, Thracians, and nomads from the North African frontier who had once fought Rome on the battlefield were funneled into the city in chains. A warrior who once commanded a tribe found himself stripped, measured, and weighed. His utility was no longer found in his leadership or his culture, but in the density of his bone and the reach of his strike. Alongside them were the common criminals, men whose crimes were deemed severe enough that their deaths had to be repurposed for public utility. But the most striking demographic was not composed of captives. A growing segment of the gladiator population consisted of the Auctorati. These were free-born Romans who walked into the Ludus of their own volition. The numbers are a stark indictment of Roman economics. By the peak of the empire, nearly 20% of the men in the arena were volunteers. These were men who had hit the absolute bedrock of society. They were driven by gambling debts, failed businesses, or the crushing weight of family disgrace. In a culture where status was everything, these men accepted infamia, a total loss of personhood and legal rights. They traded their freedom for a signing bonus. They weren't fighting for glory or the roar of the crowd. They were fighting to pay off creditors who were more terrifying than a secutor's blade. For many, the arena was the only liquid asset they had left to sell. The entry into this world was governed by the Lanista. He was the owner of the troupe, functioning as a hybrid of a modern sports franchise owner and a slave driver. The Lanista was a man often despised by the Roman elite, yet he was enriched by their bloodlust. He invested in these men like a farmer invests in livestock. He provided high-quality food, medical care that often surpassed what a common citizen could afford, and a relentless, soul-crushing training regimen. It was a cold, calculated business model. A dead gladiator was a lost asset, and the Lanista's ledger was always his primary concern. The transformation from a person to a gladiator was finalized through a specific legal instrument, the Sacramentum Gladiatorum. This was the most brutal oath in the ancient world. It was not a pledge of loyalty to the emperor or a promise of military service. It was a formal, verbal acceptance of torture and a total surrender of the self. Every recruit, whether a captured prince or a disgraced merchant, had to stand before his peers and his masters to recite the words that would define his new existence. They swore to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword.
These words were not metaphorical flourishes. They were a literal description of the disciplinary measures used to maintain order within the barracks. The threat of the branding iron was used to keep the rebellious in line. The chains ensured that no one escaped the reality of their contract. The lash of the whip was designed to break the spirit of the individual and replace it with the cold instinct of the performer. The sword was the ultimate and inevitable resolution of the contract. By swearing this oath, the gladiator acknowledged that his body no longer belonged to him. It was now a piece of state-sanctioned equipment. The investigative reality is that the arena was a massive engine of debt and demographic control. It took the unwanted, the conquered, and the desperate and turned them into a source of revenue. It was a system that thrived on the systematic destruction of the individual. Behind every fight was a ledger, and behind every gladiator was a story of a life that had been stripped away until only the capacity to kill and die remained. As these recruits marched into the training grounds for the first time, they were not just learning how to hold a shield, they were learning how to be dead men who had not yet stopped breathing. The arena did not want their lives. It wanted their deaths to be profitable. The profitability of death required an unprecedented investment in life. This investment was physically manifested in the Ludus. It was a fortress of stone and sand, usually situated in the literal shadow of the great amphitheaters. To the passing Roman citizen, it was a place of shadows and outcasts. To an investigator, the Ludus reveals itself as something entirely different. It was not a dungeon. It was a high-performance athletic facility. It was a factory for the production of spectacle. At the center of this enterprise stood the Lanista. In the Roman social hierarchy, the Lanista was a pariah. He dealt in human flesh, putting him on the same legal level as pimps or executioners. Yet in the economy of the arena, he was a vital venture capitalist. He didn't see men, he saw assets on a balance sheet. Every recruit he purchased at the slave market represented a significant cost of acquisition. Every day that man spent training was a calculated overhead expense. A gladiator who died in a clumsy, unmarketable bout wasn't just a tragedy, it was a financial catastrophe. The Lanista's singular focus was to ensure that when a man finally reached the sand, his death would be a masterpiece of profit. To protect this investment, the Roman world utilized nutritional science that would seem modern to a sports scientist today. We know this because the earth itself kept the receipts. Archaeological excavations of gladiator cemeteries, most notably in Ephesus, have allowed bioarchaeologists to analyze the mineral content of their bones. These were not the lean, muscular statues of popular fiction. They were the hordeari, the barley men. Their diet was almost entirely vegetarian, consisting of heavy mashes of barley and beans. This wasn't a punishment or a result of poverty. It was tactical. A high-carbohydrate diet created a thick layer of subcutaneous fat over the muscles. This served as organic armor. In the arena, this fat allowed for deep, bloody gashes that thrilled the audience without reaching the underlying nerves or major blood vessels. The crowd saw blood, but the gladiators stayed in the fight. The science went deeper than just calories. The bones of these men showed unusually high levels of strontium and calcium. This was the result of a specific supplement. After every training session, they drank a bitter tonic made of charred wood and bone ash. This mixture acted as a powerful recovery drink, fortifying their skeletons against the massive blunt force trauma of the arena. This wasn't a meal for a slave. It was a pharmaceutical regimen designed to build a body that could survive the impossible. This specialized nutrition was matched by medical care that was the envy of the Mediterranean. The Ludus employed a staff of medici who were the elite trauma surgeons of their era. Many, like the famous physician Galen, used the gladiator schools as a testing ground for medical breakthroughs. While a wealthy Roman merchant might die from a simple infected cut in the city streets, a gladiator had access to sophisticated wound care. They used antiseptic wines, complex sutures, and specialized tools to extract arrowheads or repair shattered limbs. The goal was cold and pragmatic. You do not let a valuable piece of property rot away from a preventable infection. But the most intense investment was the training itself. It was a process of systematic dehumanization. It centered on the palace. This was a heavy wooden post driven into the center of the training yard. For hours on end, the recruits would strike this post with wooden swords called rudes. These were deliberately crafted to be twice the weight of a standard steel gladius. This was the science of repetition. There were no shouts of battle. There were no displays of theatrical rage. The doctore, often a scarred veteran who had survived enough bouts to earn his freedom, demanded absolute silence. They weren't teaching these men how to fight with emotion. Emotion is unpredictable. Emotion gets you killed. They were drilling muscle memory into the very marrow of their bones. They were turning complex defensive parries and lethal offensive thrusts into involuntary biological reflexes. Every footfall was measured. Every breath was regulated. By the time a man was deemed ready for the arena, he had ceased to be a person with fears and memories. He had become a finely tuned biological machine. He was owned by the Lanista, maintained by the Medici, and fueled by the ash of the dead. The Ludus took the raw, broken material of the conquered and refined it into a product worth the price of a ticket. This was the true cost of the games. Before the gladiator could face his opponent, he first had to be built. The construction of a gladiator began not with a sword, but with a measurement. To the Roman mind, chaos was the enemy of entertainment. They did not want a disorganized brawl. They wanted a narrative. This narrative was dictated by the armatura, the rigorous system of specialized fighting classes that defined a gladiator's life and death. The Lanista, or training master, looked at a new recruit and saw more than a slave. He saw a silhouette. A tall, broad-shouldered man was destined to become a murmillo. A smaller, more explosive man was shaped into a threx. This was not about fairness. It was about balance through deliberate imbalance. Modern combat sports usually pair like with like. Heavyweights fight heavyweights. Boxers fight boxers. The Roman arena rejected this logic entirely. They understood that symmetry often leads to a defensive deadlock, a boring stalemate that would lose the interest of 80,000 spectators. To ensure the crowd remained on their feet, the Romans pioneered asymmetric warfare. They pitted different weapon systems against one another to see which specific flaw would be exploited first. It was a lethal game of rock, paper, scissors, played out in flesh and bronze. Consider the murmillo. He was the heavy infantryman of the Colosseum. He was a human fortress, carrying nearly 40 pounds of bronze, wood, and leather. His primary defense was the scutum, a massive rectangular shield that covered him from the chin to the mid-shin. His head was encased in a heavy bronze helmet with a distinctive fish-shaped crest. In his right hand, he held the gladius, the short stabbing sword that had conquered the Mediterranean. He was a tank. His defense was nearly impenetrable from the front. But he was encumbered. His vision was restricted to 2 small eye holes. His breathing was hampered by the metal grill covering his face. He was built for a short, violent burst of energy, not a marathon. To counter the murmillo, the matchmaker chose the thrax. The thrax represented the enemies of the East. He carried a smaller, square shield called a parmula. He lacked the murmillo's total coverage, leaving his torso and upper legs vulnerable. However, he possessed the Sika. This was a short sword with a sharp, angular bend. It was an assassin's tool designed for one specific purpose: to reach around the edge of the murmillo's heavy shield and find the soft flesh of the back, the ribs, or the hamstrings. It was a game of cat and mouse. The murmillo tried to bulldoze his opponent with sheer mass. The thrax danced on the periphery, looking for the one angle the shield could not cover. This was the calculation of the Munerarius, the official who paid for the games. He did not want a 10-second kill. He wanted 15 minutes of agonizing suspense. He wanted a display of technical proficiency. If a fight ended too quickly, it was a waste of investment. The equipment was calibrated to prolong the engagement. Most gladiators wore a manica, a sleeve of padded leather or metal scales on their sword arm. This protected the most vital tool of the trade, ensuring that even if a gladiator was wounded, he could keep fighting. They were armored in a way that protected the limbs, but often left the chest exposed. This was intentional. A wound to the arm or leg created blood and drama. A wound to the heart ended the show prematurely. Perhaps the most extreme example of this tactical engineering was the pairing of the retiarius and the secutor. This was the ultimate study in contrasts. The retiarius was the only gladiator who fought without a helmet or a shield. He was the fisherman. His only defense was a galeras, a metal shoulder guard. His weapons were a weighted net and a long trident. To the Roman crowd, he was the underdog, the man who had to run to survive. His opponent, the secutor, was literally the follower. He was designed specifically to hunt the netman. His helmet was a smooth, rounded egg of bronze. It had no crests and no protrusions. This was not an aesthetic choice, it was a functional necessity. A smooth helmet prevented the retiarius's net from snagging on the metal. The eye holes were reduced to tiny punctures to prevent the prongs of the trident from piercing the face. The secutor was a claustrophobic armored juggernaut. He had to close the distance before he ran out of breath or succumbed to heat exhaustion. The retiarius had to keep moving, using the reach of his trident to keep the heavy pursuer at bay. It was a high-stakes hunt played out in the sand. The physical reality of this equipment was brutal. A fully geared heavy gladiator carried weight comparable to a modern soldier's ruck, but concentrated in ways that restricted blood flow and respiration. Under the Mediterranean sun, inside a bronze helmet that acted like an oven, the temperature reached levels that could cause a man to collapse from heat stroke in minutes. Every movement was a calculation of energy. The matchmakers knew this. They paired styles to ensure that as one man's strength faded, his opponent's tactical advantage shifted. They were engineers of tension, looking at the physique of their men and calculating the longest possible route to a finish. This was the science of the spectacle. Each armatura was a different set of variables in a lethal equation. The Romans did not just want to see men die, they wanted to see them solve a problem. How does a man with a net defeat a man in a steel shell? How does a man with a small shield survive a collision with a human wall? The answers were written in the sand with every lunging strike and every desperate parry. The equipment was the script of the fight. By the time the gladiators stood in the dark of the tunnel, waiting for the gate to rise, the outcome was already being weighed by the experts in the stands. They knew the weights of the shields. They knew the endurance limits of the murmillo. They were not just watching a fight. They were watching a specialized piece of military hardware be put to the ultimate test. The construction was complete. The biological machine was calibrated. Now, it was time to see if the engineering would hold up under the pressure of the steel. The transition from the forge to the table was a calculated part of the Roman spectacle. While the hardware had been sharpened and the biological machine calibrated, the Roman state knew that physical readiness was only half the battle. To truly test the engineering of a fighter, they first had to break him psychologically. This process began the night before the games with a tradition known as the Cena Libera. On the surface, it was a public banquet, a final gift of luxury from the editor who sponsored the games. In reality, it was a living wake, where the condemned were forced to perform one last time before the steel met their skin. The Cena Libera stripped away the privacy of the barracks. The doors of the Ludus were thrown open to the citizens of Rome. This was not an intimate dinner among comrades. It was a marketing event and a data-gathering mission. The gladiators sat at long tables, groaning under the weight of exotic meats, game birds, and aged wine. This was a stark contrast to their daily regimen of barley porridge and bean mash. But for many, the sudden shift to rich fats and heavy alcohol was a torment. The stomach tightens when the mind knows that the next day's sunrise might be the last. While the fighters sat before their plates, the crowd moved among them like predators. Aristocrats, merchants, and common laborers flooded the hall to catch a glimpse of the men who would soon be bleeding for their entertainment. This was a voyeuristic exercise. The spectators didn't just want to see the fighters, they wanted to touch them, to smell them, and to judge their mental state. For the gamblers, this was the final chance to assess the odds. They watched the way a Thrax held his cup. Did his hand shake? Was the Murmillo eating with his usual ferocity, or was he staring blankly at the wall? Every gesture was a piece of intelligence. A gladiator showing signs of fear or digestive distress meant a shift in the betting lines. The gladiators were no longer men. They were assets being audited by the public. The atmosphere in the hall was a suffocating mix of celebration and dread. While the fans cheered and made boasts, the gladiators navigated a complex series of internal rituals. In the Roman mind, death was not just an end, it was a transition that required precise management. Many spent their final meal dictating their suprema, or last will and testament. They gave instructions on how to handle their meager belongings or how their burial funds should be distributed. A gladiator's life was owned by his master, but in these final hours, the state allowed him this small measure of agency. He could choose who would receive his favorite tunic or who would look after his family if he had one hidden away in the city. Superstition dominated the night. The gladiators were notoriously religious, often focusing on deities associated with the underworld or sudden shifts in fortune. Small altars were often erected near the tables. They made offerings to Nemesis, the goddess of divine retribution, seeking her favor so that their strikes would be true. Some carried hidden charms, bits of bone, inscribed lead sheets, or dried herbs meant to ward off the evil eye or blunt the edge of an opponent's blade. They practiced rituals of purification, believing that a clean soul was more likely to find passage to the afterlife if the worst should happen. There was also the presence of the healers and the trainers, the doctors and the Lanista. They moved through the crowd not to offer comfort, but to ensure the investment was protected. They monitored the intake of wine, preventing the fighters from becoming too intoxicated to perform the next day. The balance was delicate. A gladiator needed enough wine to dull the edges of his anxiety, but not so much that he lost his motor functions. He needed to be sharp enough to fight, but numb enough to face the roar of 50,000 people without collapsing. As the night wore on, the contrast between the observers and the observed grew more visceral. The citizens spoke of the games as a grand abstraction, a display of Roman virtus and discipline. For the men at the table, there was no abstraction. There was only the smell of roasted pork and the cold realization that their bodies were the primary resource in a massive economic engine. Some gladiators used the meal to engage with their fans, projecting an image of stoic indifference or aggressive bravado. They played the role the public expected, feeding the myth of the invincible warrior. Others remained silent, retreating into a mental space where the noise of the crowd couldn't reach them. This psychological stress test was the ultimate stress test. If a man could maintain his composure while being poked and prodded by drunken gamblers on the eve of his execution, he had the mental hardware to survive the arena. The Scena Libera was designed to weed out the weak before they ever stepped onto the sand. By the time the torches began to flicker out and the guards cleared the public from the Ludus, the gladiators were left in a silence that was heavier than the noise that preceded it. The feast was over, the legalities were settled, the superstitions had been observed. All that was left was the few hours of sleep that separated the biological machine from the pressure of the steel. The engineering had held through the night, but the dawn would bring the only test that truly mattered.
That dawn arrives not as a whisper, but as a mechanical roar. The Roman sun climbs over the Celian hill, striking the travertine exterior of the Flavian amphitheater and activating a machine of state-sponsored distraction. As the gladiators leave the barracks of the Ludus Magnus, they are no longer just men. They are the final act in a carefully choreographed theater of power. But before they ever set foot on the sand, the arena must be fed. The day begins with the pompa. This is the grand procession, the physical manifestation of Roman hierarchy moving through the streets. At the front, the editor, often the emperor himself or a high-ranking magistrate, leads the march in a chariot. Behind him come the lictors, the musicians playing long straight trumpets, and the priests carrying the heavy statues of the gods. Then come the weapons, not yet drawn, but displayed on ornate litters to tease the crowd with the promise of the steel to come. Only at the very rear do the gladiators appear, walking in their civilian tunics. They are the stars of the show, yet they are kept for last to build a specific, agonizing tension. By 8 in the morning, the heat in the stone bowl is already climbing. 50,000 people are packed into a vertical social map, from the senators in the front rows to the women and the poor in the wooden bleachers at the top. The gates of the arena floor, the Harena, swing open to reveal the Venationes. These are the beast hunts. Rome did not just want to see killing, it wanted to see its total mastery over the known world. The logistics behind this are staggering. Thousands of animals, lions from North Africa, bears from the forests of the Danube, leopards from the Middle East, have been trapped, caged, and shipped across the Mediterranean. They have been kept in the dark, starving, in the subterranean chambers of the hypogeum. When they are winched up through the trapdoors into the blinding sunlight, they are confused, terrified, and violent. The morning is for the Venatores, the specialized hunters. They move with calculated precision, using spears and bows to clear the sand of these exotic threats. The crowd watches not just for the kill, but for the spectacle of the wild being tamed by Roman ingenuity. The smell begins to change now. The fresh scent of pine sawdust is replaced by the iron tang of blood and the musk of dying predators. As the sun reaches its zenith, the mood shifts from sport to judicial grimness. This is the Meridiani, the midday executions. To many Romans, this was the time to grab food or use the latrines, but for the state, it was the essential enforcement of the Pax Romana. These are the criminals, the deserters, and the followers of forbidden sects. They are the damnati, those condemned to die. Some are forced to reenact myths where the hero dies a gruesome death. Others are simply thrown to the remaining beasts or forced to fight one another without armor until only one remains, who is then promptly executed by the gatekeepers. It is a sterile, efficient demonstration of what happens to those who defy the Roman order.
The noise drops from a roar to a low, murmuring hum of conversation and the sound of meat being dragged away by hooks through the gate of Libitina. This cycle of violence serves a specific function, panem et circenses, bread and circuses. The phrase isn't just a critique, it is a blueprint for social control. The Colosseum is a pressure valve for a city of over 1 million people. By providing free grain and free slaughter, the emperor buys the silence of the mob. In a city where the gap between the ultra-wealthy and the starving masses is a canyon, the games are the bridge. For these few hours, the poorest citizen sitting in the highest wooden bleachers feels a sense of shared Roman identity. They are not just watching a show, they are participating in the judgment of the world. The logistics required to keep this valve open are immense. The Colosseum consumes thousands of lives and millions of sesterces every year. It requires a supply chain that spans 3 continents. It is the most expensive piece of propaganda ever constructed. Now the shadows begin to lengthen across the arena floor. The bodies of the criminals have been cleared, the sand has been raked, and fresh layers spread to cover the stains of the morning. The vendors move through the stands selling sausages, wine, and betting slips. The tension in the crowd is tangible. The noise level begins to rise again, a rhythmic thumping of feet against the stone tiers that vibrates in the chest of every man waiting in the tunnels below. The morning was for the animals, the noon was for the law, but the afternoon belongs to the professionals. The crowd has been primed. They have seen the wild and the weak destroyed. Now they want to see the elite. They want to see the men who have trained for months for a single 20-minute window of survival. The engineering of the building is matched by the engineering of the human psyche. As the trumpets sound for the Munera, the main event, the transition from the biological machine to the steel reality is complete. The true test of the gladiator is no longer a looming threat. It is here. The gate opens and the sand waits. The blinding glare of the Mediterranean sun hits the arena floor as the gate locks behind. The noise is a wall of sound. 50,000 voices create a physical pressure against the chest. This is not the romanticized duel of cinema. It is a technical, high-stakes trade. The first thing that defines this space is not the steel, but the order. As the combatants square off, 2 figures move between them. These are not fighters. They wear white tunics with broad purple borders. They carry long, thin wooden rods. These are the Summa Rudis and the Secunda Rudis. They are professional referees. Their presence proves that this is a regulated sport, not a chaotic slaughter. Referees are not passive observers. They are often retired gladiators who understand the nuances of the art. They use their rods to separate fighters who get entangled. They stop the action to check a broken strap or a failing piece of armor. They demand technical proficiency. They ensure the rules are followed. No low blows, no eyes, no grappling that leads to a stalemate. The crowd wants a resolution, but the referees want a display of skill. This is a contractual performance. The biggest misconception about the Colosseum is the frequency of death. History suggests that most fights did not end with a corpse on the sand. A gladiator was a massive financial asset. The owner, or Lanista, invested years of resources into a single man. Medical care was the best available. The diet was scientific. The training was exhaustive. To lose a fighter was to lose a fortune. In many cases, if a gladiator was killed, the person who organized the games had to pay the Lanista the full replacement value of the slave. This could be thousands of sesterces. Death was bad for business. Statistical analysis of Pompey's graffiti and Roman records shows that a gladiator's chance of dying in a match was roughly 1 in 5, or even 1 in 10 during the High Empire. These men were more like modern prize fighters than condemned prisoners. They fought 2 or 3 times a year. They were celebrities. When the steel finally finds a gap in the armor, the fight does not necessarily end in a kill. A wounded or exhausted fighter knows the protocol. He drops his shield. He raises his left hand with the index finger extended, ad digitum. This is the formal request for mercy. The summa rudis steps in. He holds the victor back. The decision now shifts from the sand to the podium. The editor, the man financing the games, looks to the crowd. He is a politician. He needs their approval. They want to see him fight another day. The life of the athlete hangs on the public perception of his bravery. This brings us to the most famous gesture in history. Hollywood gave us the thumbs up for life and the thumbs down for death. This is almost certainly wrong. It does not specify a direction. Most historians and archaeologists now believe that a thumb pointing toward the throat or the chest, the turned thumb, meant death. It symbolized the sword. A thumb tucked inside the fist, known as pollice compresso, or compressed thumb, meant mercy. It signified the sword staying in its sheath. The visual of the thumb pointing down to the ground to save a life is a 19th century artistic invention. The editor would signal his verdict, and the gladiator was expected to accept his fate with stoic silence. If death was ordered, there was a specific way to die. The loser would kneel and grasp the leg of the victor. The winner would take the loser's helmet and drive the sword through the throat or behind the collarbone into the heart. It was a clean, professional execution. No screaming, no struggling. This was the final display of discipline. But for the majority, the sand offered a different outcome. If the editor granted missio, both men walked out of the gate. The victor received a palm branch and a bowl of gold coins. The loser returned to the Ludus to heal. They were the survivors of a brutal but calculated system. The blood on the sand was real, but it was regulated by contracts, referees, and economic reality. The combat was a machine of entertainment, where the value of a life was measured against the cost of its replacement. The sand is not just a place of death, it is a place of high-stakes negotiation. As the victor leaves the arena, the collectors of the dead move in to clear the stage for the next pair, but the rules remain the same. The machine never stops turning. The next 2 men are already at the gate, waiting for the summa rudis to signal the start. The spectacle is built on these rules. Without them, it is just murder. With them, it is the highest form of Roman art. The art of the arena is refined by rules, but it is governed by the ledger. To understand the Roman games is to understand a complex web of high-stakes finance and calculated risk. Behind every swing of a gladius lies a balance sheet that determines whether a man lives or dies. The Roman gladiator was not merely a fighter. He was a massive capital investment, a piece of living property whose value dictated the flow of the entire spectacle. This was the cold reality of the business of blood. The central figure in this economy was the Lanista. Often viewed with a mixture of social disdain and professional necessity, the Lanista was essentially a venture capitalist in human flesh. He scouted talent, purchased slaves at high market rates, and oversaw their transformation into elite performers. Every calorie of the high-protein diet known as the Sagina, every hour of instruction from the specialized trainers, and every visit from the highest-paid doctors in the empire was an expense recorded with precision. By the time a gladiator was ready to set foot in a provincial arena or the Colosseum itself, he represented years of overhead costs. If he died in his first match, that investment evaporated instantly. The person who brought these fighters to the public was the editor, the sponsor of the games. Usually a politician seeking to climb the cursus honorum, the editor needed the spectacle to win the favor of the mob. But popularity came with a price tag that could bankrupt even a wealthy patrician. The relationship between the Lanista and the editor was defined by a strictly regulated rental contract. These documents were not casual agreements. They were legal frameworks that accounted for every possible outcome of a bout. Under a standard contract, the editor did not buy the gladiators outright. He leased them. For every fighter who returned to the barracks alive and well, the editor paid a set rental fee. This fee covered the Lanista's operational costs and a reasonable profit margin. However, the contract contained a lethal contingency clause. If a gladiator was killed or severely disabled during the performance, the transaction shifted from a lease to a sale. The editor was then required to pay a replacement cost that could be 50 times higher than the rental fee. In the eyes of Roman law, a dead gladiator was a purchased gladiator. This financial penalty served as a powerful incentive for mercy. When the crowd signaled for the pollice verso, the editor had to perform a rapid mental calculation. Granting the crowd's wish for a killing blow meant paying the Lanista a massive indemnity. For a politician on a budget, it was often more prudent to signal for the loser to be spared, regardless of the bloodthirst of the spectators. The survival of a gladiator was rarely a matter of sentimentality. It was an act of fiscal responsibility. The pricing of these fighters followed a rigid tier system. Archaeological evidence, such as the Lex Italicensis, reveals a world of standardized combat costs. At the bottom of the pyramid were the gregarii, the novices or herd fighters. They were relatively cheap, used for the opening acts to warm up the crowd. Their loss was manageable, a minor line item in the game's budget. But as a gladiator survived more fights and gained fame, his market value skyrocketed. A veteran gladiator, known as a pallas, was a blue-chip asset. A primus pallas, the highest rank in the school, was a superstar with a brand name that could sell out an entire stadium. The rental price for such a man was astronomical, and his death premium was enough to ruin a mid-level magistrate. These men were the elite athletes of their day, and like modern stars, their longevity was in everyone's best interest. The Lanista wanted his star back to fight another day, and the editor wanted to avoid the staggering cost of replacing a legend. This economic pressure created a paradox in the arena. The more skilled and famous a gladiator became, the less likely he was to be killed. The fights of the highest-rated veterans were often the most technical and the least lethal. They were displays of supreme craftsmanship, where the risk was managed through mutual professional respect and the looming threat of the death clause. The blood that soaked the sand was frequently that of the low-level novices, men who had not yet proven their worth or earned a high enough price tag to make their survival a financial necessity. The logistical reach of this trade was immense. It required a vast infrastructure of supply chains, from the capture of recruits in the frontier provinces to the transport of heavy equipment. Every piece of armor, the bronze greaves, the decorated helmets, the specialized shields, was custom-made and maintained by a staff of craftsmen within the Ludus. The cost of this equipment was factored into the rental prices, creating a secondary economy of weaponsmithing and leatherworking that thrived on the constant demand of the games. Even the medical care was a significant financial factor. The legendary physician Galen began his career treating gladiators in Pergamum. He noted that the Lanista wanted his fighters patched up as quickly and effectively as possible. A wounded gladiator sitting in a cell was a non-performing asset. The faster a fighter returned to the arena, the faster the Lanista could recoup his training costs. This led to some of the most advanced trauma surgery of the ancient world, funded entirely by the need to protect a capital investment. The Economics of Death reveals a system that was far more bureaucratic than it was barbaric. The Roman arena was a marketplace where human life was weighed against the sestertii. While the spectators saw a struggle for honor and glory, the men in the VIP boxes and the owners of the schools saw a high-stakes trade. The roar of the crowd was the noise of the market, and the signal of the summa rudis was the strike of a gavel. The rules of the game were designed to ensure that while the crowd got their show, the business of the arena remained solvent. In the end, the most effective shield a gladiator could carry wasn't made of bronze or wood. It was the price tag hanging over his head. When the steel was at a man's throat, it was the fear of a massive bill, not the mercy of the gods, that most often stayed the hand of the executioner.
This financial preservation transformed the gladiator from a mere disposable slave into a long-term fixture of the public eye. They were not just assets to be managed, they were brands to be built. In the Roman mind, the man who repeatedly survived the sand became more than a fighter. He became a paradox of the highest order, an object of intense sexual desire who was simultaneously a legal outcast. This was a society that worshipped the strength of the winner while reviling the personhood of the performer. It created a celebrity culture that mirrors our own in its intensity, but remains unique in its sheer brutality. The evidence of this obsession is etched into the very stones of the empire. To understand the gravity of their fame, you have to look at the walls of Pompeii. This city, frozen in time by volcanic ash, serves as a ledger of Roman infatuation. Archaeologists have cataloged hundreds of instances of gladiator graffiti scratched into the plaster of barracks, taverns, and private homes. One name appears with striking frequency: Celidus the Thracian. On the walls of the Gladiator School near the Great Theater, he's described as the man who makes the girls sigh. Another fighter, Crescens the Netman, is hailed as the lord and master of the girls at night. These were not the musings of a few fans. This was a systemic fever. These men were the posters on the bedroom walls of the ancient world. They represented a raw, dangerous masculinity that stood in stark contrast to the groomed, political lives of the Roman elite. This adoration was not limited to scribbled notes and fan mail. It manifested in a bizarre and lucrative trade of physical artifacts. If you were a wealthy woman in the 1st century, your beauty regimen might include ingredients harvested directly from the arena floor. Merchants stood outside the gates after a match, selling small terracotta vials filled with a gray, viscous substance. This was gladiator sweat. Using a curved metal tool called a strigil, trainers would scrape the mixture of sweat, dirt, olive oil, and dead skin from the bodies of the champions. This grime was sold as a high-end cosmetic, marketed as an aphrodisiac and a skin treatment. The logic was simple. If the gladiator possessed the vitality to conquer death, perhaps his essence could conquer aging. The sweat was a physical link to that power. It was the scent of survival. The trade in these bodily fluids went even further. Roman physicians, often at a loss for how to treat chronic ailments, turned to the arena for a macabre pharmacy. The warm blood of a slain gladiator was frequently prescribed as a cure for epilepsy. It was believed that by consuming the blood of a man who died with such vigor, the patient could absorb his strength and banish the falling sickness. While the elite looked down on the fighters as social inferiors, they were more than willing to ingest their fluids in a desperate bid for health. It was a literal consumption of the warrior's spirit, a belief that the gladiator was closer to a sacrificial animal than a human being. But here the Roman paradox sharpens into a cruel edge. While a woman might pay a fortune for a vial of sweat or a night in a champion's company, the law viewed that same champion as social refuse. This was the status of infamous.
To be infamous was to be legally invisible. The moment a man stepped onto the sand as a gladiator, he was stripped of the rights of a Roman citizen. He could not vote. He could not hold any public office. He was prohibited from providing testimony in a court of law. In the eyes of the state, he occupied the same low rung of the social ladder as pimps, prostitutes, and stage actors. He was a person whose body was public property, and therefore he had no honor to defend. You could adore him, you could bet your life savings on him, and you could sleep with him, but you could never invite him to dinner. To touch a gladiator was to risk a social contagion that no amount of wealth could wash away. This legal exclusion did not end when the heart stopped beating. For the average Roman, a proper burial was the final non-negotiable requirement of a life well lived. It ensured the peace of the soul and the continuity of the family name. But for the gladiator, the city walls were a permanent barrier, even in death. They were frequently banned from the communal burial cemeteries where respectable families laid their dead. The fear was that the presence of an executioner or a man of shame would pollute the ground and offend the spirits of the ancestors. Instead, many of these celebrated heroes were discarded in mass pits outside the city limits, known as puticuli. These were foul-smelling trenches where the bodies of the nameless, the poor, and the shamed were piled together in a chaotic jumble of bone. There were no monuments here. There were no inscriptions praising their victories. The same crowds that screamed their names in the heat of the afternoon would turn their heads in disgust as the body was dragged out of the arena with an iron hook. After the armor was stripped and the wounds were cleaned, the celebrity was gone. All that remained was a corpse that the law refused to recognize. They lived as gods and died as garbage, caught in a cycle of worship and waste that defined the Roman psyche. This was the reality of the sand. You were a king for an hour, but you were a pariah for eternity. The social stigma of the arena was a life sentence, but for a fortunate minority, the physical sentence could be commuted. Most men didn't dream of gold or glory. They dreamed of the wood. The reality of the sand was that you were more likely to leave in a burial cart than on your own 2 feet. To understand the exit strategy of a gladiator, we have to look at the cold data. The numbers are grim. Epigraphic evidence from across the empire suggests the average age of death for a professional fighter was just 27. If you survived your first 3 bouts, your odds shifted, but the house always held the edge. By the mid-imperial period, the statistics tell a story of escalating lethality. A fighter had roughly a 20% chance of dying every time he stepped onto the sand. Over a career spanning 20 matches, the mathematical probability of survival approached 0. You weren't just fighting an opponent, you were fighting an actuarial certainty. For those who defied these odds, the ultimate prize was the Ludus. This wasn't a weapon of war or a tool for the hunt. It was a blunt wooden training sword. In the hands of a gladiator, it was the most valuable object in the Roman world. Receiving the Ludus meant you were no longer the property of the Ludus or the Lanista. You were manumitted. You were free. But this freedom came with a dark asterisk. The ceremony of the Ludus didn't wash away the stain of infamy. You remained a social ghost, a person who had once been a commodity. The wooden sword gave you your life back, but it could never give you your reputation. You were free to walk the streets, yet you were still the man who had killed for the amusement of the mob. What did a professional killer do when he was finally allowed to stop? He did the only thing he knew. He traded in violence. The transition from the arena to civilian life was rarely a move toward peace. Many survivors stayed within the system that had enslaved them. They became doctors, the specialized trainers who broke in the next generation of recruits. Others took on the role of the summa rudis, acting as senior referees in the arena, dressed in white tunics and wielding the same wooden rods that had once signaled their own liberation. They became the enforcers of the rules they had once bled under. For those who left the Ludus entirely, the private sector offered lucrative, if dangerous, opportunities. The Roman elite were hypocrites. They publicly loathed the gladiator as a social pariah, but they privately craved his protection. Former champions became high-priced bodyguards for senators or debt collectors for the criminal syndicates operating in the Subura. A man who had survived 10 years on the sand was a walking deterrent. They moved from the bright glare of the stadium into the shadows of the city, serving as the muscle for the men who had once placed bets on their lives. But the most profound cost of this career was hidden beneath the skin. Modern forensic analysis of gladiator remains provides a window into the physical toll of the arena that the history books missed. Bioarchaeologists studying the gladiator cemetery at Ephesus have found skeletons that tell a story of extreme trauma and elite-level recovery. We see evidence of high-protein diets and medical care that was centuries ahead of its time, including surgically precise bone setting. The Lanista invested in his property, but no amount of Roman medicine could protect the brain. Skeletal analysis reveals a high frequency of cranial depressions and blunt force fractures. These weren't always the killing blows. They were the cumulative impact of years of training and combat. We are looking at the ancient evidence of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. The repeated concussive force of a shield boss to the head or a heavy blow from a practice sword caused the brain to collide with the interior of the skull. The survivors of the arena didn't just walk away with scars and missing limbs, they walked away with deteriorating minds. The symptoms of this neurological damage would have been visible to any Roman on the street. The tremors, the sudden outbursts of rage, the cognitive decline, and the profound memory loss. A veteran who had earned his rudis and his freedom might spend his final years as a prisoner of his own biology. The aggression that made them kings for an hour in the arena became a liability in a society that already viewed them as monsters. They were men built for a world of 3-minute intervals and life-or-death stakes. When the fighting stopped, the internal damage continued. The exit strategy was never a clean break. Whether a gladiator died on the sand or lived to become a trainer of others, the arena never truly let go. The physical toll was a debt that could not be settled with a wooden sword. Those who survived the steel often succumbed to the silence of their failing faculties. They were the walking wounded of an empire that thrived on the spectacle of their destruction, serving as a reminder that in Rome, even the winners were broken by the game. The sand didn't just take their lives, it took their future, leaving behind only the scarred remains of men who had been used until there was nothing left to give. But the scars on the survivors were merely a reflection of the deep fissures appearing in the bedrock of the Roman state itself. By the middle of the 3rd century, the massive engine that fueled the arena began to stall. The empire was no longer the apex predator of the Mediterranean. It was a wounded giant, struggling to pay its legions and maintain its borders. Money was the lifeblood of the spectacle, and the well was running dry. In the early days, a single day of games could be funded by the spoils of gold and slaves from newly conquered provinces. Now, war was a constant expense, not a source of profit. The economic reality of the games changed everything. Bringing a lion from the Atlas Mountains or a leopard from the fringes of the Sahara required a vast network of trappers, transporters, and caretakers. As the Roman currency plummeted in value through hyperinflation, these logistics became a fiscal nightmare. It wasn't just the price of the animals. The elaborate machinery beneath the arena floor, the wooden elevators and complex pulleys that allowed beasts to emerge from the earth, required constant maintenance. When the wood rotted or the bronze gears seized, there was no longer a budget to replace them. The spectacle began to shrink. The exotic monsters were replaced by common dogs or bears from local forests. The grand theatricality was stripped away, leaving a grittier, cheaper version of the slaughter. While the treasury emptied, the social fabric of Rome underwent a radical transformation. Christianity had moved from a persecuted fringe cult to the state religion. This was not just a change in worship, it was a total shift in the public conscience. To the early church leaders, the arena was the ultimate symbol of pagan depravity. It was a place where martyrs had been made, and where the sanctity of human life was ignored for the sake of a mob's roar. The new moral order viewed the gladiator not as a hero, but as a victim of a demonic system. The end did not come with a single dramatic stroke of a pen. It was a slow death by 1,000 cuts. The gladiatorial schools, once the pride of the empire, were starved of state funding. One by one, they closed their doors, their training grounds turning into weed-choked lots. By the time Emperor Honorius issued his final ban in the early 5th century, the games were already a shadow of their former selves. A story survived of a monk named Telemachus who stepped into the arena to separate two combatants. The crowd, annoyed by the interruption to their dwindling entertainment, stoned him to death. Honorius used the tragedy as the final justification to outlaw the practice forever. The profession of the gladiator was officially dead. The massive amphitheaters that had defined the Roman skyline for centuries did not disappear, but their purpose evaporated. Without the maintenance of the state, these structures became liabilities. The marble seating was pried away to be burned for lime, or repurposed for the construction of Christian cathedrals. The lead pipes and iron clamps that held the massive travertine blocks together were dug out, leaving the pockmarked holes still visible in the Colosseum's exterior today. Slowly, the people moved in. During the Middle Ages, the Roman arena was no longer a stadium, it was a town. The vast oval of the Colosseum was subdivided. Families built houses in the arcades. Artisans set up workshops in the tunnels. The space where emperors once presided over the life and death of thousands became a cluttered neighborhood of shops, stables, and small chapels. The sand that had soaked up the blood of the finest warriors in history was covered by layers of domestic refuse and the dirt of everyday life. The transition was complete. The arena had been the heart of a civilization that lived by the sword, and now it was a hollowed-out skeleton, stripped of its glory, and left to serve as a quarry for a world that no longer understood why the blood had been spilled in the first place. The stone was hauled away to build churches and palaces, but the impulse that stacked those blocks never truly left us. It migrated, it evolved, it found new theaters. Today, we do not gather in stone bowls to watch men die for our amusement, yet the hunger for the spectacle remains hard-coded into the human genome. Walk into any modern arena on a fight night. Hear the low, rhythmic hum of the crowd before the first blow lands. That collective intake of breath when a strike connects is identical to the one that filled the Flavian amphitheater 2,000 years ago. We traded the trident for the 4-ounce glove. We replaced the wooden sword with a multi-million-dollar championship belt, but the core transaction has not changed. We pay for the privilege of watching another human being face the ultimate test of physical survival in a sanctioned environment. The parallels are not accidental. Modern combat sports are the direct descendants of the Roman moon era. Consider the logistics. The ancient gladiator was an investment. He was housed in a ludus, fed a specialized diet of barley and legumes, and monitored by the best doctors of the age. Today, an elite mixed martial artist follows a nearly identical path. They are commodities, they are brands, they are bodies refined into weapons through scientific rigor. Like the gladiators of old, these athletes exist at the intersection of extreme skill and extreme vulnerability. We admire their discipline, but we stay for the risk. We crave the truth that only combat provides. There is no script in the ring. There is no faking a knockout. It is the last bastion of raw reality in an increasingly synthetic world. Investigators of the human psyche often ask if we have truly evolved beyond the blood sands. The data suggests we have only sanitized the experience. The Roman citizen wanted to see the virtus of a man facing his end. We want to see the limits of human endurance. Both desires spring from the same dark well of curiosity. We want to know what happens when the veneer of civilization is stripped away. We want to see how a person carries themselves when they are trapped in a space they cannot leave, facing an opponent they cannot ignore. Rome was a society built on these contradictions. It was the peak of ancient sophistication. They gave us the foundations of modern law. They gave us the census, the paved road, and the concrete dome. Yet their greatest architectural achievement was essentially a sophisticated slaughterhouse. This was not a flaw in the Roman design. It was the heart of it. The gladiator represented the Roman duality in its purest form. He was the barbarian tamed and turned into a professional. He was the slave who could win his freedom through excellence in violence. To the Romans, the arena was a mirror. It showed them that their high civilization was fueled by the grit and blood of those they conquered. They did not hide their brutality behind closed doors. They put it on a pedestal. They turned it into art. This is the enduring legacy of the blood in the sand. It forces us to acknowledge that civilization is not the absence of violence, but the management of it. We are capable of building empires that span continents and writing poetry that survives millennia. We are also the only species that builds stadiums specifically to watch our own kind fight for their lives. The Roman gladiator was the ultimate symbol of this tension. He was a man caught between the gutter and the gods. Now the Colosseum stands as a silent witness to that tension. The tourists walk where the blood once pooled. They take photos where the dying took their last breaths. We look back at the Romans with a sense of moral distance, yet we are still drawn to the flame of the arena. The stone is cold now. The seats are empty. The sand has blown away. But the impulse that built this place is still very much alive, waiting for the next bell to ring. The echoes haven't stopped. They just changed their name.